Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
Let's do it. Good morning, guys. Or afternoon, because you're all European. Let's do it. Next episode, we're doing the excuse me, the last two today. The Emperor Who Never Sleeps, Extra History number 11. Theodora was amazing last episode. Phones away. Even if you're watching on one, toss it. Let's go.
Thanks to Theodora, the vulnerable Justinian hadn't been assassinated or supplanted, and he still had an empire to wake up to. But some of his enemies had kept busy during his long sleep. The plague had left a permanent scar on the Byzantine Empire. Nearly a quarter of its citizens lay dead. Crops had failed, trade had ground to a halt, and imperial revenue simply hadn't come in. The short-term consequences of this were apparent to anybody who saw the mass graves, but the long-term effects ran still deeper. In Italy, the Gothic tribes had rebelled. Having felt cheated by Belisarius' betrayal and unhappy with Roman rule, the tribes seized the opportunity to rearm and prepare for war, as plague gripped and weakened the hobbled empire. The signs had been obvious, and yet the Byzantines had done nothing. The Gothic leadership had even squabbled and fought, leaving them vulnerable and weak, and yet the Byzantines had done nothing. Why? Because they had been even more divided. The attention of imperial court had been entirely on the east, first on the Persians and then on the plague, and so there'd been little direct oversight of Italy. Meanwhile, the question of overall command had never been settled, and so instead, dozens of Byzantine commanders operated quasi-independently across the Italian peninsula. This all meant that when the Goths had finally settled their differences and come together under a man named Totila, Italy was ripe for the conquest. As the Gothic forces swept south, the towns, which were under-garrisoned and frustrated by high Byzantine taxes, threw open their doors. And when the Romans tried to retaliate, it only ended in disaster. In one famous attempt, the Byzantine forces had actually got someone to betray one of the Ostrogothic strongholds at Verona, and while a force of 100 men snuck inside and threw open the gates, the 11 commanders of the Byzantine army assembled outside bickered about how to split the loot from the town, and so caught up were they in this argument that no one ever actually ordered their army to go through the now open gates. Before the commanders were done infighting, the Ostrogoths had re-seized the gate, and the Roman force trapped inside had to leap over the city wall in an attempt to escape. Shortly after that, a Roman force of 12,000 was scattered by 5,000 men under Totila, and Italy became theirs for the taking. Save for a few major cities and a few well-fortified coastal towns, all of Italy, all of Belisarius' hard-won conquests, fell to the Gothic forces. Even Naples, with its strong walls, couldn't stand against the Ostrogothic king. Twice the Romans tried to resupply it from Sicily, but twice they failed. Once by having their fleet scattered by the fleet of Totila, and once by nature herself when the wind turned against them. And when Naples, isolated and starving, at last handed over the keys to the city, Justinian knew it was time. He needed to get Belisarius back in the fight. But the empire was already strained to its limits. Justinian made Belisarius underwrite the cost of the war, sending him off essentially without an army to collect conscripts along the way. But through all of Thrace and Illyricum, Belisarius could only raise 4,000
Just get him along the way.
men. And when he got to Italy, he found the situation to be even worse. There were very few Roman soldiers there, and they'd already gone for years without pay. Morale was at rock bottom, and every day more of them deserted to go join the Ostrogoths. Belisarius had to start all over again, from the very boot of Italy. He secured a few towns and established a presence in a few ports, but soon he found himself out of resources. He had neither the men, nor the arms, nor the supplies he needed. And at the same time, many of those that he'd recruited along the road to Italy got word of the fact that barbarian tribes had invaded their homeland and deserted to defend their own families and farms. And while Belisarius had a few successes, and would on occasion even best Totila in the field, he could never capitalize on those successes enough to move the war forward. Plagued by insubordination and low morale, he couldn't even defend Rome, the city he had spent so much of his life trying to bring back into the empire, the goal that had personally cost him so much. The Byzantine Empire just couldn't support the war in Italy any longer. The ravages of the barbarians, the assaults of Khosrow, the utter devastation of the plague, all of these had sapped the empire of its vitality, of its strength. Its reserves had all been spent on monumental buildings and grand campaigns, and when these waves of tragedy had hit, there was simply nothing left to fall back on. And so, though Belisarius was able to briefly reoccupy Rome, he was soon recalled to defend Constantinople, never to reunite Italy, and never to campaign again.
It's tragic how this man is treated. Not exactly to anyone's... I'm not like blaming Justinian or anyone. It's you got to be called when you're called, but just how fate has decided his going to Italy and being so close, and then told to come back, and then being sent back without an army and asked to grab it along the way, and then getting something, and then being called back, and then you're done. Just come on.
And Rome, that city that was to be his and Justinian's legacy, fell again to the Ostrogoths not long after he departed. Meanwhile, rebellion had flared up in Africa, and the same old story of lack of pay, disunity of command, and plague spreading through the army kept the rebellion alive for years. Fortunately, this rebellion was eventually successfully quelled the same year Belisarius withdrew from Italy, a much-needed victory amidst so many losses. It had cost more time and money than it ever should have, but at least it would not go the way of Italy. Then, in 548, Theodora died of cancer. Justinian wept at her casket, the indomitable emperor in tears for all to see. He would not marry again, even though he lacked an heir. He chose to name his nephew-in-law as his successor, rather than betray her memory. But even as she had neared her death, the entire time he never forgot his empire. After so many failures and setbacks, many others would have just sunk into dejection and let the empire rot, but never Justinian. Say what you will about him, but Justinian never once abandoned what he thought to be his duty. He worked to slowly put the pieces back together with the same tireless spirit he had applied in the glorious days after the Nika revolts, but perhaps without the same joy. He continued the war in Lazica, but prevented the conflict from turning into an all-out war between the Byzantines and the Persians. He tried to reorganize the defenses to put up some resistance to the ever-mounting barbarian raids from the north. He began to get the Byzantine economy moving again, and though it was often complained about, he re-established a system of taxation to slowly fill the imperial treasury, and to pay for all the armies he needed to protect an empire assailed on all sides. And though the weight of the world could be seen on him after Theodora's death, though he had perhaps lost some of the fire he once possessed, and no longer found as much joy in his old passions, he did undertake one last great project, a project that had been most dear to Theodora. It would perhaps be the greatest he ever embarked on, and it would perhaps be his greatest failure. One last time, Justinian attempted to heal the split in the church that had plagued his empire. A split that would do more damage to the empire than barbarian raids or Persian kings, one which would last for centuries. If we talk more about Byzantium in future series, this split is gonna keep coming up. Now, when most of us think about splits in Christianity, we usually think about the split between Protestant and Catholic, but
Orthodox
this divide was just as bitter and ran just as deep. This was the divide between the Monophysites and the Orthodox. It was a problem that Justinian had studied for years. Theodora had been Monophysite. He himself was Orthodox. Their reign was supposed to be a symbol of unity, and yet the divide had persisted. He had many times tried to find solutions, but nothing had ever stuck. But he had one final grand idea. The church was split concerning a complex theological question over the singular or dual nature of Christ, but in practicality it really came down to whether one accepted or refused the decisions of the Council of Chalcedon, where the dual nature of Christ had become orthodoxy. Justinian thought that he'd found a clever solution in the fact that the three strongest voices supporting that dual nature view also came from the now considered heretical Nestorian branch of Christianity. So, if he could just get everybody to condemn those guys, they could serve as scapegoats for the problem. Monophysites could accept Chalcedon, and everybody could move on. He had made this proclamation in the year 543 while Theodora was still alive, but he would fight to get the leaders of the church to sign on for the rest of his life. He worked to see that the Pope, who was staying with him during a period where he was exiled from Rome because it was in Ostrogothic hands, endorsed his view. The Pope eventually gave in and agreed, though with great reluctance because he knew exactly what it would mean to his followers in Italy. He knew what would eventually prove true. This would not heal the schism in the East. Rather, it would simply end up creating a schism in the West. And so Italy has fallen. Theodora is gone, and the great project that their union was supposed to symbolize, the healing of the faith of the empire, lies in tatters. But slowly, Justinian is rebuilding. He's not done yet. So join us next time as we conclude the reign of Justinian.
Theodora, my woman. She was amazing. Justinian, I know I'm being hard on him because of some like stupid inside joke. But clearly he had a good. I'm just so used to watching figures in military combat, and so when I see him delegating, I shouldn't see that as a weakness necessarily. And he did a lot of good things in terms of the structure of his empire, and that might be more important than any military conquest. So I understand.
Our time with Justinian is nearly at an end. His conquest of Rome lost, his people decimated by plague. The last man to dream of a reunited Rome has seen that dream slip through his fingers. But Justinian was never idle, even as he crossed his 65th year, and he was never one to give up on that dream. And though it would never seem as natural or as inevitable as it must have in the 530s, to the mind of Justinian, the thing that had once seemed his glorious destiny was still in the 550s his responsibility. And so, where luck, brilliance, and splendor once served, labor, persistence, and time would now be his tools. With monumental effort, an empire near ruin was brought back to a functioning and even somewhat prosperous state. With renewed national fortunes came that lifeblood of armies, money. With the cash in hand to once again pay soldiers and equip troops, Justinian prepared to deal with the threats that had assailed the empire from all sides. And so we come to one of the most inscrutable parts.
I thought that guy had like fangs for a second.
That had assailed the empire from all sides. And so we come to one of the most inscrutable parts of the reign of Justinian, the last company, the final group of men that he would choose to execute his will and restore the empire. For he chose a group of men who seemed like impossible candidates. They were ancient men, the last of a generation. He picked the septarian Basus to retake Lazica, though he had largely been at fault for re-losing Rome. He chose Scholasticus, a court eunuch without any experience in the field, to command forays against the Slavs to the north and to retake Italy. He picked the aging eunuch Narses, the same Narses who had bribed the demes for Justinian during Nika, and yes, the very same guy who may have doomed the first Italian campaign by disputing Belisarius' commands. It was a strange bunch to put in charge of an army, and yet in Lazica they won. They took Petra and at last made a peace with Persia that recognized Lazica as part of the Roman sphere. And in the Balkans they won. It may have taken some diplomatic wizardry from Justinian, but they won. And in Italy? In Italy, Narses did what Belisarius could never do. He finally kicked the Ostrogoths out of Italy entirely. Sure, he had 20,000 men at his disposal and a full purse to work with, but with these resources, he was at last able to pin the Ostrogoths down in open battle, and truly, conclusively beat them in the field. In Italy, they finally won. Heck, while Narses was out in Italy, Justinian even received a letter from Hispania requesting his help, and sent 2,000 men under the command of the octogenarian bureaucrat Liberius, who promptly took over half the country and set up the province of Spania. If nothing else, Justinian's one great talent was somehow, even when all odds seemed against it, knowing exactly the right person to pick for a job. And that talent hadn't failed him, even when so much else had.
Yeah.
But nothing is ever quite done. A wave of natural disasters hit the empire, and then the plague returned. While it didn't quite bring the empire to its knees the way the first wave did, it did create an opening for the Bulgars to sweep out of the north and raid the empire again. A contingent of them even came within 100 kilometers of Constantinople. With no other armies nearby, Justinian called on Belisarius one last time. The general, who had long since put down his arms, gathered together a force of retired soldiers, guardsmen, and volunteers from the demes for one last service to the empire. And here he did
get his own army again?
What Belisarius does. He set far more campfires than he had men, and as the battle began, he had his main force make as much noise as possible while he secreted away a part of his army for an ambush. And when the Bulgar forces attacked, they thought themselves outnumbered and surrounded as the ambush force poured fire from one side, and they heard the great din from the other. And so they fled. But that would be the last service for Belisarius.
Damn.
And one by...
He's like, yeah, easy.
And so they fled. But that...
Easy. Alright, you want me to go? Give me 2,000 men. I'll light some fires. Yell a lot. Easy. Game over. GG.
That would be the last service for Belisarius. And one by one, the chapter closed on all of our players. Tribonian had died in 542, Theodora in 548, John the Cappadocian fades out of the historical records sometime in the 550s. In 554, mortality makes even our historian Procopius put down his pen. And Belisarius? He himself passed in 565. Almost all of the minor players, those who have just had a bit part on Justinian's stage, they too are dead. Justinian is alone. The only one to outlive them all would be Narses, who would make it to the grand old age of 95.
Nika. They yelled, Nika.
The only one to outlive them all would be Narses, who would make it to the grand old age of 95. But he was out there in Italy, reorganizing the province. A generation of greatness had passed. Justinian would spend his last years trying to consolidate what he'd achieved, and continuing his ill-fated attempts to reconcile the Christian church. But the days of glory and of boundless empire were at an end. In 565, after one of the longest reigns of any emperor in Roman history, and just a few months after Belisarius, he too died. It's almost impossible not to wonder what his last thoughts were. Did he see the success of his conquests, or their cost? Did he die a man disappointed at failure to achieve his dream, to see a reunited Rome and a reunited church? Or did he look out at the Hagia Sophia one last time and think about how much he'd grown the empire, how he'd rationalized the laws, brought Rome back into the fold, and seen the empire through the plague without being torn apart by civil war? We'll never know. To this day, Justinian remains one of the great what-ifs of history. What if the plague hadn't struck? What if the Ostrogoths had capitulated one of those dozen times they were just about to? What if the Persians had been led by somebody less competent, or just been a little slower to attack? What if Justinian's successors were as energetic and as capable as he had been? If any one of those things had turned out differently, perhaps we would consider him the greatest Roman emperor of all time. Perhaps the West would speak Greek and Latin and still see Constantinople as its capital. But none of those what-ifs took place, and within 100 years almost everything he had gained would be lost. Only the Hagia Sophia and his law code would truly endure. And for his conquests, for his vision of a Western empire, what did he sacrifice? Perhaps everything. He emptied the Byzantine treasury, taxed heavily, created thousands of miles of new borders to guard for an empire reduced by plague and a soldiery reduced by his own wars. Italy would turn out to cost the empire more than it ever brought in, and North Africa would suffer a series of rebellions and convulsions due to his inability to pay the troops there. Would the Byzantines be so unprepared for the Muslim conquest 70 years later if Justinian hadn't squandered the empire's resources on the ephemeral West? Would the empire have been bled dry by continuous Persian wars and further conflict with barbarian tribes to the north if Justinian had just instead focused all that energy on settling these problems rather than...
Damn, this episode has got me on a roller coaster of emotions towards Justinian. Yeah, I hadn't acknowledged his ability to delegate, which I almost saw as a negative. But then I don't want to use hindsight too much to say he was terrible. He obviously wasn't terrible. He was good, and I'm sad that Theodora's gone, and he couldn't have known that the Muslim conquests were going to be happening, and so all of these what-ifs are... I shouldn't use them to put down Justinian too bad.
...than his romantic dream of restoring Rome. But for all this, one can't help but respect the dream and the monumental efforts of the men of his age to make it come true. And in hearing about his work, one can't help but get a little lost in that dream, and imagine what the empire would have been if he'd achieved the success he came so close to. And so we leave Justinian and all those who stood by his side as a question and a cautionary tale, an enigma and a promise, a parable to inspire us to dream, and a warning against being blinded by our own vision. And though the reign of Justinian is at an end, we continue to feel the echoes of these men and women centuries later, their triumphs and their failures. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Awesome. Really cool. My opinion has transformed a bit, especially in the past few episodes. It's just people... Sometimes I have to be a contrarian, I guess, and just when a bunch of... Good. He was a good ruler, all right? Belisarius and Theodora were a bit better. It was really cool. I enjoyed that a lot, guys. Yeah, I hope you're all doing well. Chin up. If not, you'll be good soon. Bye, guys.